Engaging the youth vote in Canada. The question explored in this presentation is, how much does exposure to outside political influence and discussion impact Canadian youth voting? The concepts and identifiers were taken from the dataset Elections Canada National Youth Survey. Tests include reliability analysis, cross-tabulation, and Kendall's Tau B. The issue of youth voting is very important in Canadian politics today. As a result, many papers and articles have been written on the subject. A few that were used for this research assignment are shown here. Mark Mayrens, Canada's Chief Electoral Officer, has said, engaging young Canadians is key to maintaining a healthy democracy. As leaders, educators, or parents, we each have a role to play in fostering civic participation among youth. Additionally, Stolle and Cruz have said, political socialization studies suggest that some of the most basic democratic attitudes and behaviors are ingrained early in the life cycle through family experiences, civic education, and peer and other social relationships, and they remain remarkably stable throughout a lifetime. So, the long-term consequences of changing social and political involvement patterns of Canadian youth might be felt for many generations to come. According to Stolle and Cruz, outside influences such as family and friends hold influence over young Canadians and their view on politics. As such, the dependent variable for this study is an index measuring political discussions held with family, friends, and colleagues. When tested for reliability, these indicators show an alpha of 0.6505, which shows an acceptable level of internal consistency. After running a frequency of this index, the mean was revealed to be 3.362 with a median of 4, a standard deviation of 1.025, and a kurtosis of negative 0.470, which shows that this kurtosis has a lower, wider peak around the mean and thinner tails. The skewedness is 0.888, which indicates that the tail is on the right side and is longer than the left, and the bulk of the values lie to the left of the mean. In order to explore what factors encourage political discussion with young Canadians, 3 independent variables were chosen for cross-tabulation. What is the highest level of education that you have completed? Do you have a profile or account on any of the following sites, Facebook and Twitter? And did you vote in the last federal election held on May 2nd? When analyzing the first dependent and independent variable, it is predicted that with the higher level of education, the higher the exposure to influencers will be. In other words, the higher the level of education a Canadian youth voter completes, the more likely they are to be engaged in political discussion. After running the first cross-tabulation, one can see the strong relationship education and political discussion has. A Canadian youth is far more likely to be engaged in political discussion if they have continued on to post-secondary education. When one looks at the table, one can see that 56.2% of respondents who attended post-secondary education also had high levels of political discussion in their lives. Whereas these same students, only 6.3% of them had low levels of discussion in their lives. This reveals that the higher level of education one has, the more likely one is to be engaged in political discussion. This is confirmed when looking at the less than grade 12 column. Only 26.1% of these respondents had a high level of political discussion in their lives. When looking at the Kendall's Tau B of 0.22953, one can see that it's a positive association, which reveals the previous hypothesis to be correct. The higher level of education one has, the more likely they are to have a political discussion in their lives. This is possibly due to the fact that post-secondary students are trained to think more critically and are often engaged in discussions on contemporary issues in a scholarly setting. What can be drawn from this is that education is extremely important in getting Canadian youth involved in politics. For the second independent variable, the hypothesis is, it is predicted that if a Canadian youth voter is active on a social networking site such as Facebook or Twitter, they will subsequently have a higher rate of being involved in politics and political discussion, and therefore be more politically active and aware. After running the second cross-tabulation, it was revealed that 50.1% of respondents who said yes to having a Facebook page were also having high levels of political discussion in their lives. Only 9.8% of people who had a Facebook page were not involved in political discussion. This shows that political discussions do happen and is likely also taking place on Facebook. The positive Tau B score of 0.05928 reveals a positive association, meaning the hypothesis is most likely correct. However, when one looks at the Canadian youth who responded to not to having a Facebook page, it is 44%. Though not very high, it is still a significant number and reveals that though not having a Facebook page, they are still involved in political discussions. This shows that social media may not be playing as big of a role in political discussions as previously thought. There are still political discussions happening with Canadian youth offline. Similar results were shown with Twitter. 54.5% of young Canadians with a Twitter account are also taking part in political discussion. The positive Tauby score of 0.05357 once again shows the hypothesis to be correct, yet just as with Facebook, there is still 47.9% of young Canadians without Twitter who are discussing politics offline. The third and final hypothesis is, it is predicted that if a Canadian youth has a high exposure to political influences and discussion, it is more likely they will vote in political elections, as seen on the election on May 2, 2011. As expected, the cross-tabulation of the third independent variable reveals that it is more likely a Canadian youth voted in the election on May 2nd if they had a high exposure to political discussion in their day-to-day life. 56.6% of respondents who said yes to voting also had high levels of political discussion. 34.4% of respondents who did not vote on May 2nd had high levels of political discussion. Only 5% of those who voted on May 2nd had low levels of political discussion in their lives. This, along with the positive Kendall's Tau B of 0.25070, reveals the hypothesis to be correct. The more political discussion and debate happening in a young Canadian's life, the more likely they are to go out and vote when it comes to elections. In summation, one can determine that with a post-secondary education, young Canadians have a higher involvement in political discussions with family and friends and colleagues. They are less likely to be engaged in political discussion if they have a less than grade 12 education. When it comes to media, if a Canadian youth has a Facebook page or a Twitter account, they are more likely to be engaged in political discussion. However, it is important to note that the differences between the yes and no is a mere 6% difference in the high political influences row for Facebook and 7% for Twitter. This shows that Canadian youth don't necessarily use social media in relation to political engagement. As predicted, the cross-tabulation of the third independent variable reveals that it is more likely a Canadian youth voted in the election on May 2nd if they had a high exposure to political discussions in their day-to-day life. It is important to analyze what influences discussions among young Canadians when it comes to politics. The more discussions held on politics between young Canadians, the more likely it is they will become politically active and vote in elections. As young Canadians are the future of the country, it is vital to get them excited about their country's politics. That way, the future of the country is ensured to be a positive and prosperous one. There is still further research to be done on this topic. For example, one could take the data set and review the data to determine effective ways to influence behavioral change in youth in order to implement this information into strategies to encourage youth voting. Additionally, qualitative research, such as focus groups with identified non-voters and subgroups, could be used to dig deeper into what is keeping the youth from voting and subsequently explore potential solutions. Some questions that could be asked are, what characteristics would make polling stations feel welcoming or otherwise? What would make polling stations youth-friendly? What is the role of different influencers and what makes them effective or otherwise? What would it take for non-voters to change their attitude towards voting, and what would make voting more convenient for today's youth? As mentioned, the youth vote is an incredibly important one. Therefore, it is important to explore all avenues of research on this topic. Thank you for your attention.